that good in his heart that he couldn't bear to be without us. So he'd come with a most tremendous crowd and make such a row at the doors of the houses where we was, that they used to be obligated to have no more to do with us and to give us up to him. And then he took us home and hammered us. Which, you see, Pip, said Joe, pausing in his meditative raking of the fire, and looking at me, were a drawback on my learning. Certainly, poor Joe. Though mind you, Pip, said Joe, with a judicial touch or two of the poker on the top bar, rendering under all their due, and maintaining equal justice twixt man and man, my father were that good in his heart, don't you see? I didn't see, but I didn't say so. Well, Joe pursued, somebody must keep the pot a-boilin', Pip, or the pot won't boil, don't you know? I saw that, and I said so. Consequence, my father didn't make objections to my going to work, so I went to work at my present calling, which were his too, if he would have followed it, and I worked tolerable hard, I assure you, Pip. In time I were able to keep him, and I kep him till he went off in a purpleleptic fit, and in it were my intention to have had put upon his tombstone that, whatsoever the failings on his part, remember, reader, he were that good in his heart. Joe recited this couplet with such manifest pride and careful perspicuity that I asked him if he had made it himself. I made it, said Joe, my own self. I made it in a moment. It was like striking out a horseshoe complete, in a single blow. I never was so much surprised in all my life. Couldn't credit my own head. To tell you the truth, hardly believed it were my own head. As I was saying, Pip, it were my intention to have had it cut over him, but poetry costs money. Cut it how you will, small or large, and it were not done. Not to mention bearers, all the money that could be spared were wanted for my mother. She were in poor health, and quite broke. She weren't long a-following, poor soul, and her share of peace come round at last. Joe's blue eyes turned a little watery. He rubbed first one of them and then the other, in a most uncongenial and uncomfortable manner, with a round knob on the top of the poker. It were but lonesome then, said Joe, living here alone, and I got acquainted with your sister. Now, Pip, Joe looked firmly at me, as if he knew I was not going to agree with him, your sister is a fine figure of a woman. I could not help looking at the fire in an obvious state of doubt. Whatever family opinions, or whatever the world's opinions on that subject may be, Pip, your sister is, Joe tapped the top bar with the poker after every word following, a fine figure of a woman. I could think of nothing better to say than, I'm glad you think so, Joe. So am I, returned Joe, catching me up. I am glad I think so, Pip. A little redness or a little matter of bone here or there, what does it signify to me? I sagaciously observed, if it didn't signify to him, to whom did it signify? Certainly, assented Joe. That's it. You're right, old chap. When I got acquainted with your sister, it were the talk how she was bringing you up by hand. Very kind of her, too, all the folks said, and I said along with all the folks. As to you, Joe pursued with a countenance expressive of seeing something very nasty indeed, if you could have been aware how small and flabby and mean you was, dear me, you'd have formed the most contemptible opinion of yourself. Not exactly relishing this, I said, Never mind me, Joe. But I did mind you, Pip, he returned with tender simplicity. When I offered to your sister to keep company, and to be asked in church at such times as she was willing and ready to come to the forge, I said to her, "And bring the poor little child. God bless the poor little child," I said to your sister. "There's room for him at the forge." I broke out crying and begging pardon, and hugged Joe round the neck, who dropped the poker to hug me and to say, "Ever the best of friends, ain't us, Pip? Don't cry, old chap." When this little interruption was over, Joe resumed, "Well, you see, Pip, and here we are. That's about where it lights. Here we are. Now, when you take me in hand in my learning, Pip, and I tell you beforehand I am awful dull, most awful dull. Mrs. Joe mustn't see too much of what we're up to. It must be done, as I may say, on the sly. And why on the sly? I'll tell you why, Pip." He had taken up the poker again, without which I doubt if he could have proceeded in his demonstration. "Your sister is given to government." "Given to government, Joe?" I was startled, for I had some shadowy idea, and I'm afraid I must add, hope, that Joe had divorced her in favor of the Lords of the Admiralty or Treasury. "Given to government," said Joe. "What I means to say, the government of you and myself." "Oh!" "And she ain't over partial to having scholars on the premises," Joe continued, "and in particular would not be over partial to my being a scholar, for fear as I might rise, like a sort of rebel, don't you see?" I was going to retort with an inquiry, and had got as far as "Why?" when Joe stopped me. "Stay a bit. I know what you are going to say, Pip. Stay a bit. I don't deny that your sister comes the mogul over us now and again. I don't deny that she do throw us back falls, and that she do drop down upon us heavy. At such times as when your sister is on the rampage, Pip." Joe sank his voice to a whisper and glanced at the door. "Candor compels for to admit that she is a buster." Joe pronounced this word as if it began with at least 12 capital B's. "Why don't I rise? That were your observation when I broke it off, Pip?" "Yes, Joe." "Well," said Joe, passing the poker into his left hand, that he might feel his whisker, and I had no hope of him whenever he took to that placid occupation, "your sister's a mastermind. A mastermind." "What's that?" I asked, in some hope of bringing him to a stand, but Joe was readier with his definition than I had expected, and completely stopped me by arguing circularly and answering with a fixed look, "Her." "And I ain't a mastermind," Joe resumed when he had unfixed his look and got back to his whisker. "And last of all, Pip, and this I want to say very serious to you, old chap, I see so much in my poor mother, of a woman drudging and slaving and breaking her honest heart, and never getting no peace in her mortal days, that I'm dead afeard of going wrong in the way of not doing what's right by a woman, and I'd fur rather of the two go wrong the other way, and be a little ill-convenienced myself. I wish it was only me that got put out, Pip. I wish there weren't no tickler for you, old chap. I wish I could take it all on myself, but this is the up and down and straight on it, Pip, and I hope you'll overlook shortcomin's." Young as I was, I believe that I dated a new admiration of Joe from that night. We were equals afterwards, as we had been before, but afterwards at quiet times when I sat looking at Joe and thinking about him, I had a new sensation of feeling conscious that I was looking up to Joe in my heart. "However," said Joe, rising to replenish the fire, "here's the Dutch clock a-working himself up to being equal to strike 8 of 'em, and she's not come home yet. I hope Uncle Pumblechook's mare mayn't have had set a forefoot on a piece of ice and gone down. Mrs. Joe made occasional trips with Uncle Pumblechook on market days, to assist him in buying such household stuffs and goods as required a woman's judgment, Uncle Pumblechook being a bachelor, and reposing no confidence in his domestic servant. This was market day, and Mrs. Joe was out on one of these expeditions. Joe made the fire and swept the hearth, and then we went to the door to listen for the chaise cart. It was a dry, cold night, and the wind blew keenly. The frost was white and hard.